You're now plugged into the Delphi podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Tommy, and I'm thrilled to host a crypto AI versus centralized AI podcast with four of the absolute brightest minds that I could find on the topic. I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves, but we have Ben Fielding, who's the co-founder of Jensen. Jensen's building decentralized compute to push the boundaries of machine learning. We have Travis Good, who's co-founder of Ambient, and they're focused on world scale open source models, and they are a portfolio company. So that'll be team, I'll call them the team crypto AI side. And then from Delphi, we have Michael Rinko, who's senior markets analyst who wrote Delphi's first report on AI called The Real Merge in February 2024. And we have PD, who's an analyst at Delphi Research, who's anonymous. So that's what we'll call him here. And he wrote The Tower in the Square, which was just an amazing report on centralized versus decentralized AI, very balanced and very thought-provoking. And that's sort of what we're here to discuss. But let's go in that order. Ben, why don't you give your quick intro and we'll go around the room.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for doing this and for having me. So yeah, I'm Ben, co-founder of Jensen. Jensen's a machine learning compute protocol. You can think about us as a protocol layer, a bit like the early web protocols, that just sits across machine learning capable hardware and allows it to be used for any machine learning training task in the world. So the idea is, instead of using AWS or Google Cloud or something as a resource to train your models, you can use any device in the world, and you can send your model directly to that device or a kind of subset of the world's devices, but of any size. It turns machine learning compute into a resource, a bit like electricity, like a commodity, rather than being this kind of like individually named GPU that you have to kind of rent from somebody and book time on. It just becomes this kind of always available ops kind of trading market, essentially.
It's helpful. Travis, let's go to you next.
Sure. Yeah. My name's Travis. I'm the co-founder of Ambient. I have in terms of my educational background, I have a PhD in IT. Prior to this, I've been focused on AI-related applications in industry for the best part of the decade, including some related to drug discovery and critical infrastructure.
It's helpful. Michael?
Hey guys, I'm Michael. I'm an analyst at Delphi. I primarily focus on markets, but talk a little bit about everything. Like you mentioned, Tommy, I wrote a report on AI a couple months ago now, which was a fun one, and excited to debate with you guys today.
PD, top left, you're up.
Yeah, I'm Pondering Durian. So I'm on the research side on the infra team at Delphi, and background's kind of in investing across consumer internet, enterprise software, and crypto in the US and in APAC. So yeah, excited to be here and nice to meet you guys.
So Pondering Durian, just start us off with maybe a synopsis of the report, right? One of the most interesting and like timeless arguments I think we'll ever have or debates is centralized AI, giant Web2 companies versus what we're able to do in crypto AI in the open source world and through a decentralized manner. So give us a brief synopsis and we'll dive in from there.
Yeah, so the title of the report was the Tower in the Square, and it's basically a nod to a book by Niall Ferguson, which he's a historian out of Stanford who I like, and he wrote a book that effectively talks about the dynamics between hierarchies and networks over time, right? And so I think that if you think about the last 30 years, it really has been a story of the rise of networks. So you had globalization, liberalization, capitalism, the internet, crypto, social media, et cetera. So it really has been kind of about the rise of networks. But I think over the last like 5 years, you really have seen the tower and traditional hierarchies kind of reassert themselves. So states and corporations. And I think the advent of AI does seem to be, a pretty large centralizing force in its current instantiation, right? And so I think the real question in front of us and that we're here to debate is basically, are we headed for a world where there's a handful of multi-trillion parameter models that are governed from small pockets in the west coast of the US that basically underpin large swaths of society? Or are we heading for a world with kind of a tapestry of millions of different types of models of all shapes and sizes? And so I think there's really good arguments to be had on both sides, and that's why we've got some gigabrains here to debate it.
Yeah, Ben or Travis, I'm not sure if you want to maybe kick off there with sort of your view, right, on team maybe more open source or crypto AI.
Sure, absolutely. And just playing it back a little bit, PD, what I hear you saying is that we've seen kind of massive consolidation in this space, vertical scale that's been achieved that is giving closed sourced AI kind of a definitive advantage right now. And I tend to agree with that assessment. And then, I want to portray the alternatives you pose and just offer a little bit of a quibble with that. I think you're saying, are we going to just be up against the trillion parameter foundation models that closed source is coming out with, or like a plethora of models? And I think there's another option, which is that open source does its own, trillion scale parameter models to sort of fight back in terms of capabilities. But is that roughly correct in terms of the setup that you're talking about?
Yeah, no, I think you've said it well. So yeah, so far we've seen kind of the vertically integrated offering speed ahead in terms of capabilities, but those moats haven't necessarily proven to be as sticky,
Yeah.
as kind of the Web 2 era. And so it does seem like it's pretty open. So I'd say closed source players seem to have an edge right now, but we'll see what happens going forward. And I think DAI and open source have a credible playbook to provide alternatives, both at the large scale end and all the way throughout the stack. So yeah, TBD.
Perfectly agree with that. And I think maybe it's helpful at this point to sort of break down some concepts around what is desirable normatively and what is possible. And so in terms of the desirability of closed source, I'd love to just think out loud a little bit with all of you for a second. And Ben, feel free to chip in. I have this idea that probably many of you have heard about, where we're all cyborgs. We're really computer mediated. We're constantly getting information from our phones, from all sorts of different devices. We're all augmented humans right now. And I think that AI is going to be, or AGI is going to be, our co-processor in the future. It's going to be something that we're constantly bouncing off of to improve our own capabilities. We might even have direct neural integration of this thing into our minds. And so I think the question you have to ask yourself is, do you want that co-processor to be trustworthy? And it's really hard for me to come up with an argument, that these vertically integrated surveillance capitalists that we're talking about are going to provide a trustworthy solution there. And it seems on an individual level, not even a social level, we can talk about that in a second, like a really dangerous thing to give companies that have a history of abusing both users and their business customers that kind of power over our minds. To take it one step further, I would say, we didn't accept the Clipper chip, which was the NSA's attempt to backdoor all of our encrypted communications. And I don't think we should accept an attempt on the part of closed source companies to get in between us and the coprocessor, the mental coprocessor that is helping us think. So that's what I would say on an individual level. I'm going to stop there before I talk about what's desirable on a social level to let other people chip in, and feel free to debate some of those assertions.
I strongly agree with that kind of view of the future you gave. I think machine learning and like AI as an augmentation is the most obvious kind of evolution of it. And I think we've been going through this with technology anyway, right? Like you look at how we use the internet and the generations that have grown up with access to a shared knowledge base. There's some research, I don't have the kind of references to hand, but the way that we memorize information changes. We memorize the ability to retrieve the information via like Google rather than memorizing the information itself. And I think that trend just continues where humans kind of like learn around access to this new tool. And so it becomes just kind of interlinked completely. I agree with the sort of like social premise that we don't want an individual kind of entity to control that. We don't want that individual entity to have censorship capabilities over the thing that is basically within our brains at that point. I do think though you can model it just as a like incentive system at the end of the day. Like those businesses aren't doing something malicious, they're doing something that's fully expected, which is pursuing profit, which like is what we expect of businesses, is why the system is designed. But we have to think right now about the small tweaks we can make to those incentive structures as to whether we can still let them evolve organically in the typical way they will and pursue the incentives, but without accruing that too much power into one place, because we've seen that with monopolies in the past and the horrible effects they have on the world in certain areas. But this one looks kind of exacerbated when it's like direct control to an extent of what people think. You could say that's what happened with social media, but then this is the kind of next level of depth again. So essentially just agree with all the kind of premises you gave, and it's the same view of the world that we hold for sure.
I would just go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna, I guess, provide the other side of the argument for play a little devil's advocate here. So I think one of the challenges with this specific debate is it's never really clear what kind of like AI people are talking about. Are we talking about today's AIs, like chatbots, essentially, ChatGPT, or are we talking about AGI in however many years, or are we talking about artificial superintelligence, the thing that's going to run the world and colonize the galaxy, right? And I think the trade-offs and the incentives and the whole debate changes depending on which kind of bucket you're talking about. I think the easiest one to reason about is like today, what's in front of us right now. How do we build the safest possible world today with today's technologies? And I think right now, indisputably, closed AI is probably the safest way we could manage this technology today and for the foreseeable future. And I'll just lay out a couple of points, and then would love to hear what kind of you guys react to it. But I think when you said like incentive structures, Ben, that kind of set off a little bell in my head. I actually think like capitalism and our current like economy has really good incentives. Companies get very richly rewarded for building products that are useful and that are safe for people. And if you don't build a useful product, or if you hurt people, you don't make a lot of money based off that. You know what I mean? So at a very like bottom line, the current incentives like seem to work. You know what I mean? The world generates an incredible amount of wealth per year. Inequality has declined. All these metrics generally show that like the world has improved over time. And I think a large part of that is due to capitalism, is due to this like system of rewarding people for solving problems in a safe way. And I don't see anything about AI that would like make capitalism not work. So I think kind of like trusting this technology to the private sector isn't as bad as people make it seem, because all you're doing is just trusting that like capitalism does its thing, and a bunch of these mutually kind of distrusting and competing parties in the private sector compete against each other to be the most useful and deliver these technologies in the safest way possible that solves problems for consumers. And if you kind of believe in that fundamental tenet, then generally speaking, like the best solution in the safest possible way will emerge. And I think that's like a good future. Whereas if you, to take the other side, if you allow this technology to be maximally open, anybody with a computer and internet can create and propagate one of these AIs. At some point, probably not today, but at some point in the future, these things will be able to do significant damage and harm. And there are people in the world that will use that for malicious purposes. And I don't really understand how we stop them from doing that. And I think probably the best way to do that is some sort of like gated access, which the private sector seems to enable.
Go ahead.
Can I just add one point? Because I think the safety argument and the capitalism argument is good, but I also would just throw in that, like, over time, every generation of consumers has basically opted to choose convenience over, the idealistic privacy solution, right? And so realistically, over the next 3, 4, 5 years, what I'm more worried about is, hey, I agree with your social vision. I think your social vision is great, but realistically, every consumer's got an Apple iPhone in their pocket. Everyone already uses Google. They have this beautiful integrated Google suite, that's going to be integrated with AI. And, I'd say it is, to me, a little bit too idealistic to think that these co-processors that are run by big companies won't automatically kind of find their way via the easiest route to being utilized by consumers to be the default solution over time. And I think these products will be really good, to Michael's point, right? And so you might just end up on a slippery slope where, because of these natural advantages, users kind of opt for these products because the uses are actually very good, even if it's suboptimal from a societal level. So that's just one thing that I would add.
Yeah, I agree with the kind of progression, especially with users. Like, an ideological reason to adopt something just doesn't hold in the mass adoption case. It might hold for a small group of users, but it doesn't spread. My previous startup was in privacy, in consumer privacy specifically, and I very very deliberately learned that lesson quite hard. But just to Michael's point, at the end, when you kind of presented the danger of the other route, you started the point with grounding us in the present, but the danger of the other route jumped quite quickly to what could happen in the future. And I think that's what kind of always happens when we try and discuss the dangers of AI. It always comes down to what could it do theoretically in the future, and we kind of have this unbounded space of things that it could do. But if we think about right now, like what are the actual dangers that you could do with the system now that doesn't require this appeal to kind of future capabilities of these models? Because if you do that, it could be anything, and you lose the ability to argue against it because there's literally any possibility. So I pose that as a question. And then just finally on the kind of capitalism piece, sort of like solving those negative sides, I'd agree that it can solve that as long as there's auditability. So if there's no auditability, if a company can get away with something negative for the world in pursuit of profit without it ever coming back around and affecting that profit, I assume that as a financially rational actor, that company would do that. So we have to have some level of auditability within the system to allow those things to be discovered. You could take that argument and you could run down a government regulatory kind of route with it, or you could go down the other route of just saying, hey, actually just open development of certain technologies is a better thing for the world. Like, we can have the auditability without affecting a company's ability to go and kind of build these models. And that's especially true when it's the value within the thing itself isn't necessarily how it's built, it's in something else. And I think we're still figuring out as a world where the value is within machine learning models. Like, I have a very particular view. I think it's in distribution, but like ultimately we've moved around all over the map on where it is. And I think we've kind of come down to it doesn't necessarily sit within like the architecture of the model. That could be open. There's other areas where the proprietary kind of value sits.
I would like to interject and build on some of your points and also disagree a little bit. So, I was taking some notes, Michael, and it seems like you first talked about incentive structures and how they've worked out really well. And I think the average consumer would probably disagree with you. Cory Doctorow talks about the great enshittification of the internet, and anyone who's ever used Google knows that it is a terrible user experience compared to what it was for the average consumer. It's actually also a terrible business experience for a business trying to advertise. The process of, enshittification occurs when the disintermediating party, in this case, Google, which is managing that relationship between like the business that's buying ads and the consumer who's viewing ads, when they start to take too much of the pie for themselves. And, what we've seen with, discovery, from lawsuits against Google is that actually they kind of rigged the game in their own favor. Like, they were driving up the prices of those ads for the businesses. They're making it so it was very hard for users to find, meaningful results. And, they haven't experienced real consequences for that. And so then you have to drill a little bit deeper and ask, why that is. And, perhaps the answer is because there's inappropriate regulation or a lack of regulation on the company's behavior. Perhaps the answer could be momentum. But what we've ended up with is a situation that is far from capitalist optimal. You haven't got like a perfect user experience out of this. History has actually shown that we've got something like what I would call oligopoly optimal, where the surveillance capitalists have been richly rewarded at the expense of pretty much every other business type you could imagine. For example, I don't think news outlets have been loving how Facebook has been treating them over the years. And so I would argue that all we have to do to know how the future is going to look if we submit ourselves to these big tech companies, what that trajectory looks like, is just to look at the past. Look at the rise of teen depression as a result of Facebook's algorithmic manipulations. Look at all these other abuses. But please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up some good points, Travis, and I'll I guess respond to some of them. I don't know. We might just have different views here. I'm very optimistic. I think technology over the long arc of human history has improved people's lives. I think if you pulled someone from 100 years ago and dropped them into today, they would find the experience of being able to text someone instantly, FaceTime somebody, call a car that arrives directly to their home, get food delivered directly to their home. They'd find that like nothing short of like pure magic. You know what I mean? So I there's all sorts of these side effects that come up with the teen depression and stuff. And that's terrible. I think, we should try and solve that and make it better. But like that's a small component of like the good that this technology has created. And I think AI will be no different. On top of that, I guess just to respond to something that you said, Ben, I think you brought up a great point on like the hand wavy, like, oh, it's going to be dangerous one point in the future. And that's very fair. And I actually think that I fell into that trap earlier. The one thing that makes AI like particularly hard for me, and I think many people to like reason about, is it like nobody really understands it. You like even like these top labs don't understand why the models are doing what they're doing. And I think when you look at like historical examples of technologies that were like dual use or like dangerous in nature, like the atomic bomb, you could like test the bomb, and like if it exploded, then like that's bad and we shouldn't release that. But if it didn't explode, then it doesn't work and like it's not dangerous. You know what I mean? With these models, it's not clear if like they work in some cases, but then they can't do other things. So then should we release them in the, you know what I mean? The lines are way blurrier. And to me, it's really difficult for like a regulatory body or even like the top experts that are closest to these technologies to figure out like safeguards. So yeah, kind of curious how you guys think about that.
Go ahead, Ben, if you want to respond.
I just very quickly, there's a piece in it you mentioned earlier being optimistic, but then the idea that these technologies, we don't know how they will kind of present themselves to the world. So assume a kind of bad case out of them. Like surely the optimistic stance would be they're not negative right now. We don't know if there could be bad outcomes, but optimistically it should be fine. So it kind of flips pessimistic when it comes down to the model itself and what will happen in the future.
PD, I'd love to get your thoughts on this take, just from the other side too.
Yeah, so I guess like kind of back to Travis's point, I think there's no mistaking the argument that there is a market concentration that has evolved like quite aggressively over the past couple of decades, right? And so I do think there's this element of, because of the inability for consumers to find what they want because there's 4 trillion pieces of information coming at them, you need some sort of curation, right? And so this is effectively what Ben Thompson at Stratechery has been arguing for the better part of like, 2 decades, that if you aggregate demand online, then supply comes. And so you do have this like network effects that do form around these walls gardens because they're really good at curating. And so these companies have developed, kind of data monopolies and cash flow monopolies from these privileged positions that they have developed, right? And so this does give them inordinate market power that over time starts to be more extractive than it was in the early growth phases of the network, right? And so because AI seems like it's a little bit more of a sustaining technology than a disruptive technology, it actually serves to entrench some of that market power further unless we have, a different solution, right? And so if you think about what it takes to be a dominant foundation model, like generally the inputs right now are talent, data, distribution, and capital. And I'd say, from dominating the Web 2 era and like generating those network effects and those users and being the source of curation online, those entities are super well positioned in the new era of AI. And how expensive compute is, the proprietary data sets that they have. And so yeah, I think from my vantage point, while that might not be socially optimal, that is a reality of the system that we find ourselves in. And I don't think like capitalism is bad. It just seems like there are 4 or 5 companies that do have a lot of market power today. And from my position, you look at the S&P 500, with 5 companies representing, 30% of that and only set to increase. It seems like that is an issue. And we are heading for a world where, in this next generation of the internet, instead of the pendulum swinging back towards decentralization, it might actually concentrate further. And so that's just something worth flagging, that structurally, it does seem like there are these tailwinds in the system that we've created behind 4 or 5 companies that basically have, a lot of market power.
Yeah, and so I'd love to just sort of chip into a few things. The security point keeps getting thrown out there, and I don't want to jump too far into the future, but I do want to point out a couple of things about the threat model as it relates to the current configuration that you're talking about, PD, where we've got 4 companies that have all the data, and in the future they're going to have agentic chatbots. And I actually think this is an absolute disaster of a threat model. And the reason is that, first of all of these companies have been hacked. We have documented evidence of, for example, Microsoft under repeated audits, failing to protect crucial national security data, getting their hardware enclave keys stolen, which is supposed to be impossible, but, it was managed. And like by concentrating all this data and honestly these capabilities for models to reach out and touch all the parts of your digital life, you are just making those companies the single most attractive hacking targets for every nation state, for every independent hacker group, and so on. And I think if that power was more diffused, and if we had credible open source contenders to perform some of these functions, that wouldn't be the case.
Travis, can I interject for 1 second?
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned earlier that like the current state of tech is kind of like oligopolistic, right? What would be the difference between the data concentration in today's tech world and tomorrow's AI tech world if the same oligopolies continue to persist?
Let me just play that back so I make sure I understand. You're saying like, well, okay. Yeah. What's the progression? Yeah. Okay. So let's get into that. So let's make it very concrete. So, at this point, ChatGPT is integrated into Notion, into like Evernote, into spreadsheets, into pick your product, and it's got controls and tokens that allow it to sort of act on your behalf in a lot of different programs. And so what that means is the data progression is incredible. Like you get an incredible amount of personal private information that accumulates in these providers. And, that combined with the data that is captured via surveillance capitalism, via all the signals that are coming out of your phone, all your cookies that are coming out of your websites and so on, like produces like a wonderful intelligence dossier on everyone. And so I actually think that concentration of data accumulating creates a huge national security threat for the country, for the US. The background check provider for the US government was hacked a few years ago that did all the security clearances. And that was a disaster. But this would be very much equivalent. And we know, and this is where the security argument becomes really funny. We know from a bunch of OpenAI insiders and other insiders that have stepped forward from these tech companies that their security is absolutely terrible. And we also know that the government security is terrible. So, like, if we adopt this idea that this is a healthy paradigm, we are just setting ourselves up for what I would call a very fragile situation. And I'd be happy to talk about this whole thing in terms of notions of fragility and anti-fragility in a little while. But that would be my sort of response to that.
Travis, just to dive in here a little bit, I feel like the two sides so far to me appear one ideological, like the crypto AI side is, this is what we want. This is more consumer preference, more privacy, better for the future. The tower side seems more maybe potentially realistic right now. Like they have the most data, they have the most hardware, they have the most talent. It is the most intuitive to use something on your phone that you already have. Like maybe could we describe for a minute, maybe for Ben or for Travis, like how do we build an actual competitive alternative? Right?
Totally. Yeah,
how,
I think I think it's a great question, Tom, and it goes to that kind of what is desirable versus what is possible. So I'm happy to take a crack at it, and then also pass it over to you, Ben. So in terms of what is possible, I think that it's important to note that ML is not a hard scientific field. Like actually anyone can contribute to ML. And there have been a lot of contributions made that, are pretty straightforward alterations of previous paradigms. And so there's kind of a low barrier to entry for ML, which I would say, going back to your question, Tom, bodes well for the future of open source capabilities. Because as compute gets cheaper and cheaper, people are going to have the ability to experiment at higher and higher scales with innovations with ML models. And so I think you're going to see a potential for the world's talent to mobilize in service of this endeavor. I also think you're going to see a lot of different governments waking up and deciding that they want their country to be competitive in the new economic paradigm. And so they're going to be sponsoring a lot of this. I think you're going to see research institutions all around the world focusing on building capabilities in this area. And so I would say the current state is, we're not really there. We have some models that are sort of in the ballpark of, some previous generation models. But I think the future state is actually very bright because you're going to be looking at the collective talent of people all over, not just in San Francisco, say, applied to solving a challenge which is tremendously economically rewarding. So that would be, one comment. I could drill deeper into different aspects of that. But was that responsive to your question, Tommy?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Ben, I'm curious your take, right? Be curious, add to Travis's thoughts.
Yeah, I think the two sides that we kind of presented here do kind of blur quite a bit, because I think both sides are basically saying what we want is high levels of like normal capitalist behavior and competition. But the sort of like tower model, as it currently progresses, the incentive is on the large model builders to stop that from happening. They don't necessarily want that level of competition. And there's a layer of resources that sit underneath ML that can be controlled to a large degree to stop that competition from happening too much. But like Travis said, ML itself isn't that hard. So like the expert knowledge required to do machine learning has already been like open, like decentralized, disintermediated. Academic publishing has done that. Like you can get access to the papers at least until a certain point when OpenAI kind of started capturing researchers to go and build one of those models. You could actually put the code together to do it, but then you would hit the next roadblock, which would be, can I get the data to train this model? That's to a large degree also been kind of opened because there's enormous amounts of open data on the internet. There's lots of things that we butt up against with copyright, etc. But you can get access to very, very large amounts of data to train these models as an individual. But then you hit the next constraint, which is compute. And compute is one that is much more easy to control. If you have essentially unlimited resources, you can just kind of take the vast majority of this kind of finite resource and you can lock it away somewhere. The fact that the people building models also have the kind of largest cloud providing ecosystems as well means that they're able to control the supply, they're able to control the cost of access to that resource. I think if you look, like, path this out into the future, what does ML become? ML becomes this thing that's constrained by electricity. Ultimately, it's conversion of electricity into kind of knowledge transformation. You need a specific piece of hardware in order to do that. So that hardware resource is the thing that people can capture. And I think if we let this continue in just the way it does, in the oligopolistic way, there becomes an incentive for those companies to control their profits by capturing the resources underneath. And that's the bad thing that we don't like. If it's true actual competition over value to an end user, sure, let's do it. Let's make it as open competition as we possibly can. But this isn't necessarily true open competition. It's capture of a resource and rent seeking on top of that resource, which I think we probably all agree isn't a good outcome of capitalism. You don't want just pure rent seeking. You want actual value creation. I think naturally it progresses in that way anyway through usage. Like OpenAI thought that they could capture enormous amounts of compute, funnel capital into that, make a model that would then be their moat, and then they could just kind of print money off that while everybody tried to catch up. But the fact that model can be distilled through its usage completely undermines that, which is an amazing just property of models. Like, you just can't sort of sit on it and like rent it out. It will just it'll erode in value. So then it becomes, well, how else do I continue to create that moat? One way is regulatory capture. Another way is create an ecosystem of people building on top of it. That's the way that we like. It's the way of saying, okay, let's get more people building, more people competing with each other on the actual kind of front ends to this technology. And then what you get is, what's the real value of ML? The real value of ML is right down to the user. Are you providing me something that actually makes my life richer that I want to pay for? And I think that just gets driven down and down and down until we're competing over the best front ends, the best access to these models, the best interfaces to the parameter space that's being created. Behind that can be a completely open ecosystem, which would have richer competition and the outcome that I think we're all actually saying we want here. And it's just a slight tweak to the way we do it to stop that resource capture happening.
Yeah, and I just, to the art of the possible, first of all, I think what you said was absolutely brilliant, Ben. So thank you for making a lot of points more clearly than I could have. Secondly, I would say, in terms of the art of the possible, I would make this historical commentary. I think that the massive scale up that we're seeing in AI compute data centers is a little bit of an accidental gold rush. In other words, if ChatGPT had never been released, then we might never have seen this focus on using a particular paradigm for model training to scale up. And now that this has become the paradigm, the big players are all locked into that. And it's a very easy model for them to get into because capital in, product out. That's kind of how it works. Like the training methodologies and the secret sauce are relatively straightforward. And but the question is, like, what capitalistic incentives start to exist to counteract that? And I think that obviously, like, forms of distributed training, more efficient training, training that can leverage the tail of compute and so on, is going to come to the fore because it's just too economically valuable. And so as long as we can kind of prevent some of the worst case scenarios that Ben talked about, where regulation locks down all compute everywhere, like, we can expect that there are going to be open source consumer friendly solutions for things like distributed training that are going to pop up. And just to name a few of them, we've seen huge advances in back propagation free training show up just in the last couple of months. There's an example of a technique that entirely eliminates matrix multiplication and radically decreases the need for data sharing that was published recently. There are all sorts of other papers that are getting around the limitations, the bandwidth limitations imposed by the current paradigm. And so it's not there yet, but I think within 1 year, my estimate would be that we will see 3 compelling alternatives to the big data center paradigm that will give a little bit more oomph to the efforts on the open source side.
I think you guys both bring up really compelling points. And I guess just to put a pin through it, like one of the big questions for me right now is, are the scaling laws true? Are you long or are you short the scaling laws? You know what I mean? And just to lay out both sides of it, if you're long the scaling laws, I think, as you both said, then you're going to amass as much compute as you can and just basically hope that scaling up these models yields increasingly capable models. If you're short the scaling laws, then at some point you think that the relationship between compute and loss breaks, or at least levels off, and you believe that these models can be distilled down, or you believe that maybe the current deep learning paradigm is just wrong, and AGI will come out of something that doesn't quite look like this current flavor of models. I don't really have a strong view there, but like, to me, there's kind of like 2 distinct camps here. Like, it seems like OpenAI and Anthropic. So I think it was the GPT-3 paper that came out that like kind of popularized the scaling laws. And ever since then, OpenAI, Anthropic, and then obviously Google have been amassing as much compute as possible. They're kind of the big proponents behind like scale is all you need. That will get us to AGI. And then it seems like there's this other camp, which I think maybe many people in like the crypto AI space fall into, but also interestingly, a lot of the top researchers at Meta have basically said that like LLMs are like not going to get us to AGI. We need a new approach. You can't just like memorize the whole internet and expect general intelligence to like spawn out of that. Do you guys have like a view on that? Because that question seems like really important. If it is all scale and compute, then I don't know how you beat the big guys. You know what I mean? So it feels like we're all kind of implicitly betting that there's something else that you can't just get from scaling up these models, because then you're in like an unwinnable resource game, you know?
I don't think the scale piece necessarily points to only the centralized approach. I think that's the bit where that kind of takes a different turn, because you think about scale. What does that mean? Is can I make a model over a certain number of devices, and can I create more devices and make a model over that? And we are currently in a brute force scaling paradigm. I think it's throw compute at it in the most centralized, easy to model way, and we get a quick win to show what's possible. And it's kind of like the tip of the spear of machine learning, where it says, hey, the world didn't realize something on the order of ChatGPT was actually possible. Now it does. But what comes after that? What's the wave of things that happen once you've proven that? Well, you then go and improve those things. It becomes no longer a research problem. It's like an execution engineering, performance optimization problem. So there's a huge wave behind that of this commoditization of those models, shrinking them, quantizing them, compressing them, making them sparse, all of these things to make them actually quicker and easier and faster to run. So you kind of, to have that real proof, hey, the world, this is possible, you have to have that big brute force amount of compute. But then everything afterwards, all the products that get built, can be built in a much different way, in a smaller way. That brute force approach itself, though, is starting to hit a wall. So previously, I used to say the wall.
Well, why do you think it's hitting a wall, if you don't mind me asking?
Access to data center space to put enough devices into, to have them interconnected at a scale that is larger than what we currently have. I used to say that was down to funding. So you'd have to have more and more money to do that. I said that to somebody very senior at Meta, and he laughed and said, basically, we have unlimited funding. It's not that. It's the fact that there aren't that many places geographically on the planet where you can build data centers that can sustain this level of kind of interconnected devices, which leads the hyperscalers down this route of actually doing horizontal scaling. So you see like a wave of papers now that say, hey, actually, let's do multi-node, multi-data center modeling. like model that out in your head, where does that go? Well, Google can do it over 3 data centers, but then what if somebody can get devices in 4 data centers, 5 data centers, etc.? Ultimately, the maximum scale of that is connecting up all of the world's devices, and that has to go across companies. So a single company competing against every other company is not going to win. So if you can build a layer that allows that to happen, that is going to be the ultimate scaling win.
I see. I just want to make sure I understand this point because I think it's an important one. You're saying that we can't make the data centers any bigger than they are right now, or we can't build more data centers in general because there's not enough electricity? Like what's like the fundamental constraint?
We can. There's diminishing kind of returns to doing it. So finding and securing the location that can sustain the level of electricity required, the cooling required, etc., the kind of local regulations of noise to actually have something that can hold enough of these devices in one place is becoming much harder. It's getting harder and harder and harder and harder. So the hyperscalers are fighting over the remaining areas on the planet to actually build something. At some point that ends. Like there is a logical endpoint to that. If you can, however, incentivize people to build those who could sit anywhere on the planet, it's not just finding a single data center, incentivize people to host them anywhere, then you can connect those up and you can create a larger cluster. There's some downsides to that. So like the communication speed between those kind of smaller but more distributed clusters is worse, but that's not necessarily just a breaking change. It's just another thing for us to build around. It's an engineering execution problem, which we've kind of got lots of history of the internet of overcoming. Like we can overcome latency problems. We can do lots of distributed systems work to solve those things. So our kind of Jensen's view is very bullish on scaling, but scaling to the max rather than scaling in this competitive way between hyperscalers, which we think just reaches a kind of limitation eventually that we can't get past.
I would say that there are two answers to this, and you're giving one of them, Ben, and then I have a particular view which you may not share. So, I think one answer essentially that Michael is coming across is that actually the big players are going to have to come over to a more distributed paradigm in order to scale. And that's actually going to slow them down because they're in the wrong paradigm right now. The paradigm they're in now is so expensive and so unattainable at the hyper and unsustainable, not to mention, at the hyperscale that they have to shift at some point. And that shift, given all the investment that they've made in centralization, is incredibly costly for them. And I think there's a moment where open source can catch up with that. So that's one point. But then I think you're also asking like a slightly different question, which is, assume that we got rid of that problem and we could just hyperscale to infinity. Like, is there actually a plateau for model capabilities? And I think that this is where we start to get into discussions of alignment. And so, just to ground this discussion very slightly, I mentioned at the beginning that I worked in critical infrastructure for some time. And so I'm pretty familiar with what you have to do there to ensure safety. And, the gold standard for safety in safety critical applications is formally verified systems. In other words, you have to mathematically prove that a system behaves in a certain way under certain stimuli, and that's a very difficult thing to do. So now let's just think about applying that to like large language models, the current state. Like essentially, in a normal application, any API call you make is something that could be formally verified. You would have to do a huge amount of work to formally verify that API call because that's a route through the logic of the system. But large language models essentially have unlimited API calls because everything that you say to it creates a functionally different path through the model. And that problem actually gets worse when you start adding in large context, because all of a sudden the context can shift the path even further. And so I actually don't think that scaling is going to drop off. I think that our ability to successfully manage these models and deploy them in a responsible way is going to drop off far before the performance of the model drops off.
And aren't we already there though? Like we don't understand why the model outputs what it does today.
I think we're
Well,
butting up against that quite a lot with technology, right? Like we're just moving to a probabilistic world. Like self-driving cars is a great example of it, where we know that they are statistically safer than a human driver, but because they are probabilistic, we just have this kind of like social blocker in accepting that they will be safer. So we say, well, we have to formally prove that they are definitely going to make the safe choice in a certain scenario. We can't look at the kind of statistics and say, well, actually, on average, over the long time period, they will be safer. I think from my perspective, humanity just kind of has to come to terms with moving away from like imperative, like formally verified logic from machines to they're probabilistic, but in aggregate, we assume that the behavior is optimistic for humanity.
I think that's a very rational argument, Ben. I just want to make one comment, which is that that sort of works until if you accept the claims of like the Ilias of the world, you hit a point where the AGI could do extraordinarily dangerous things, and one mistake could be catastrophic for civilization. And so the question is, if I want to deploy a system and there's like a 30% chance, because I have this unlimited API attack surface, that system is going to do something catastrophically bad for civilization, like, can I apply your model, Ben, to deploy it? And my answer would be absolutely not. And then you're not going to deploy it. And then the whole curve flattens out for a bit while everyone tries to do fundamental research to figure out how to actually do super alignment right. That's kind of my mental model of it.
That requires that appeal to some kind of huge negative outcome that could happen, though. It requires that, like, there's been no kind of examples given that something that a model could do right now. The examples are always, well, what if a model could do this in the future? And we can always have that, right? That's the point with the probabilistic model. You could always say that that could be an outcome. I think that's the point. We have to come to terms with the fact that there will be potentially very high impact negative outcomes, but very low probability on them, which as humans, we kind of deal with that anyway. We're like probabilistic beings when we interact with the world. It's just we move to be much more imperative with technology. So, I guess the point is that kind of impact goes beyond us as individuals, whereas humans in kind of like a previous life, we would just be thinking probabilistically with respect to ourselves rather than like the entirety of humanity in some way. But still, I feel like it's a shift back.
I feel like this is going to spiral pretty quickly into an AGI like super alignment. So I guess it's just bringing it back to kind of closed versus open. And
I can pull it back there if you want.
Thanks for bringing us back, BD. I like how you keep doing it. It's helpful.
No, well, I guess my point is I kind of feel like there's this reflexive loop between the capital markets and the hyperscalers right now, right? Where, hey, they're getting a lot of cheap funding. They obviously have 400 billion on their balance sheet. They throw off 1.5% of GDP in cash flows. They're projected to spend $1 trillion in CapEx. So they do have a lot of firepower to pursue these scaling laws that Michael was talking about, right? And I think the big question is, hey, does the revenue come to justify continued investments, right? And so there's a question between like the moats that each generation of model brings and the value capture that they can get, and can they onboard kind of the next 100 billion in revenue from corporates and startups that basically use their models and are underpinned by their models? Because if not, then people will stop funding them, and basically Google and Amazon and Facebook will all get slapped quite aggressively. And so they won't be able to build those $100 billion clusters. So I don't know if there's enough space. I think basically the financial constraints are what matter here, frankly. And so do the returns justify $1 trillion in CapEx spend for centralized models? And I think, that is a question around what like the ultimate moats are for AI in terms of like large foundational models, and then also how quickly some of these distributed systems can catch up, or these distributed training runs can catch up in order, and then also how much value capture is there at the very, very high end versus just kind of what gets commoditized. So I'd love to get like Ben and Travis's thoughts on those questions, because to me that kind of seems like the algorithm we're dealing with, the returns to these massive upfront investments that they're making and how far that can take them kind of to the scaling law question.
So I can hit that quickly. I would say it's a snowball model. I've expressed to all of you before, or at least most of you, that I view AI as an economic displacement technology. Essentially, the more capable AI models become, the more economic work they displace and the more valuable they become. And, back to your point, PD, the question is, like, is there a moment where it looks implausible that that snowball is going to continue building, where people chicken out and say, hey, like, we don't want to dump any more CapEx in this thing. We've kind of hit that point of diminishing returns. And I actually believe that that moment is perhaps when we get into real alignment problems, like we were talking around earlier. And it seems like they might be insoluble because we actually don't have a good theory of how machine learning. So that would be one answer. And then I would just make one comment, regarding open and closed source things. I actually think that the economic value of AI is enhanced in a world where safety research is done openly. And the reason for that is because that decreases the risk of anyone being unaware of the state of the art of safety research, of countries and institutions not putting in the right protections, and so on. Having that information as widely disseminated as possible makes a better economic environment for everyone.
So can we compare what you just said to like the race for the nuclear bomb? Would you have wanted that fundamental research to be open source, widely distributed? Because there was a case back then, which I think even some of the top scientists at the time believed, that if everyone knew what the state of the art was, then it would be like kind of this mutually assured destruction. We'd all have the same thing. We'd all be pointing our guns at each other at the same time, and that would yield the safest world. Whereas the other side of the camp was, we need to build this first. We need to get to the finish line first. We point our big guns at you, and then we have this like checkmate no matter what you do. And I actually feel like that's probably the best. It's not perfect, obviously, but that's a decent fractal for where we find ourselves in this AGI race right now.
I'm so glad you asked that, because I actually think it's the absolute worst analogy that could possibly be used. So let me break it down. First of all, we need to look historically at what did happen. So what happened is that we thought that we had this route to military superiority and ascendancy. And the reality was it almost leaked immediately. So we might have had that aspiration to completely shift the balance of power, but reality intruded on that and actually reestablished the balance of power. So I would ask anyone who's pursuing that if they actually think that that is a realistic goal. The second thing I would say is that the nature of ML research is so fundamentally different from physics research that it causes the comparison to completely break down. And to be very specific about that, I would say there are two paradigms that you could look at. There's an institutional paradigm where you have a small coterie of qualified scientists who can be controlled by the state. And there's a network linkage paradigm where you have an extremely wide distributed base of knowledge with a relatively low skill floor that's required to get into the field. And like tons of people around the world are qualified if you only give them access to compute. And so I would say from that network analysis standpoint, like the idea that we could even impose an institutional model on ML is completely laughable. And what that would lead you to do if you were to follow that policy would basically be to lock all, like, let's say, American ML research down for 3 years to the great detriment of the public and its access to the economic benefits of that, and then have it stolen 4 years later by a foreign government, or maybe even more quickly than that. And so you would do a lot of securitization for absolutely no benefit. And I could go into the anti-democratic aspects of what you'd have to do to switch the model from a sort of an institutional to network linkage. But yeah, I think that's a really bad plan.
I think just looking at that nuclear example, right? We ended up at the mutually assured destruction state, right? And you kind of posit the scenario that doing that in an open way would have been somehow disadvantageous, even if it would have resulted in mutually assured destruction. But I think that depends who you are in that scenario as to whether it appeared in a good way or not, right? But if you think, well, if it had been open, maybe we could have achieved mutually assured destruction without use of the technology, right? Like, did that need to happen? Did that kind of like proof point have to present itself to the world as the superior force, or would we have potentially had two forces who have that, knowing that if they use it, the other will, and you skip ahead to the mutually assured destruction scenario rather than having to have the kind of in between, which is pretty damaging for the world, to be honest.
Yeah, I think you guys both bring up good points. And I agree. I think there's some, I mean, people debate this all the time, but like my view is that nuclear weapons, the advent of like nuclear weapons is directly responsible for like this period of long peace. We've avoided a great war since World War II, in large part because you could blow up an entire country now. And I actually think that's, in a weird way, been like very useful. It's been like a useful like trump card that now multiple people have, to your guys' points. But so you could say, okay, great. If everybody has AGI, then like that'll yield the safest world. I don't actually think that's a lesson, because if we just go back to nuclear weapons again, if you extend that logic out, like, would you want every country to have a nuke? You want Hamas running around with a nuke right now? You want the Taliban in Afghanistan running around with a nuke? There's been many precarious times in history where it was up to like literally one dude, like the guy, I'm forgetting the story, but there was a guy on a Russian submarine, right, that thought the World War III had broken out, and it was up to him whether he launched the nuke at the US. He decided not to. You know what I mean? And if that's one guy, but if you expand that to like many people have the ability to launch that nuke, that the odds go up that someone presses that button. You know what I mean? So I think like one of the saving graces of like nuclear weapons is that they're really hard to build. And I agree with your point, Travis. Like these models are not that hard to build. You know what I mean? So I think it breaks down a little bit, but to me, you still want to like limit these super powerful, potentially destructive technologies to like a smaller amount of people in general. Yeah.
So I would just
Or-
say, go ahead.
No, I'm just gonna say, or you just make sure that you kind of stay ahead, right? And whether that's like, so I guess like one of the ways that I don't know, maybe this is going to be a spiral into a different area that's unhelpful. But yeah, like I guess I think about it in terms of just like military capability or cyber capability. Like there's always going to be, potential attack vectors, but if you stay one step ahead, then, like Hamas shot all those rockets, but Israel has the Iron Dome, like, you kind of have this threat model where the threats are constantly evolving, but the defense is also constantly evolving. And also, I think there's hopefully a correlation between the desire to do those things and general wealth of the planet, right? So I think the more affluent people get, like generally, the less appetite there is for war or for destruction between countries, right? So I think affluent democracies have never actually had a war between themselves, right? And so some of that's ideological, but some of that's also affluence, right? And so if you let kind of the benefits of ML or artificial intelligence start to percolate through the global economy, and that is managed effectively in a way that also, doesn't accrue just to Microsoft shareholders, then I think you can actually have like a really good outcome. But it is a very difficult needle to thread. And so I agree, there's tons of threats and it could go totally wrong. But I also think like generally locking it down and basically just saying, hey, like, certain state actors are the only ones that are going to have this. Hey, maybe you want them to be one step ahead of the rest. But I generally think like letting it proliferate is probably the optimal outcome in a well-managed way.
So
It sounds like we're all on that
yeah,
kind
actually,
of view, right? Because like
yeah.
I guess in that view, you say, well, the most optimal thing for a state to do in that case is just invest heavily in this, like alongside everybody else. So like the state is then pushed to say, okay, we have to stay ahead, but we don't do it by like pulling everybody else back. We just stay ahead, which is typically what like defense research is in general, right? Like it's like these technologies, fund effort into them, put large amounts of kind of capital behind exploring whatever the kind of next frontier is, and I think that's generally good.
How does that work now? How does that work now when commercial is so far ahead of the government, though?
So
what is it?
Yeah, so, okay, well, I just want to jump in here and say that there are two things that are going on, and I think we need to disentangle them. So for me, and this is why I always get a bit worked up when we talk about AGI in military terms. For me, AGI is predominantly an economic paradigm. AGI is labor substitution. It has some military applications. And so
But the military is the biggest company in the world. They employ more people than any company in the world. So there's an obvious dual use there now.
Well, I agree that there is a dual use, but I think you have to, whenever you look at closing something like this down, you have to look at the hard power aspects of it and the soft power aspects of it. And in service of that, I would just like to play out a little scenario for you and let you think about like what the effects of that would be. So, I view AGI tech as kind of a soft power thing. It's an economic power thing. But let's say we treated it like hard power. We completely locked down AGI and we denied all the economic benefits of AGI to everyone except the military, essentially. So, what are you actually doing there? You've lost your ability to deploy that in the economy, and you might, militaries are powered by their economies. Reality is our ability to project military force is dependent on our economic capabilities. If we're so deeply in debt or we're so far behind other countries in terms of our ability to use agentic protocols to achieve efficiencies that will result in growth and profit that can be reinvested, then we've actually lost any war that we could possibly imagine, because someone is just the person who is the country that is using that capability economically is just going to win. And when you set it up like that, when you look at both sides of it, it's hard not to see how a country that did both and investigated the military applications and also deployed in the wider economy wouldn't end up winning.
Yeah, I think I agree with that end conclusion. I mean, I maybe have a slightly different view on like what AI or AGI you might have said is. Like, to me, it like we're just building like intelligence here. And then like intelligence is like the input to everything. So if you have like unlimited intelligence, it's like electricity. You don't really know what you're going to do with it. It's just there. It's a force in the world. So I think to argue that like AI won't be dual use is crazy. I don't think anyone's doing that. But I think will definitely be dual use. Governments will be super interested in it, already are. And I think to loop it all the way back to your original question, PD, about like whether or not the revenues can kind of catch up to the expenses of these models. To me, I take a slightly different angle there. I think like the more important thing to watch is like whether or not we see a plateau in the capabilities. As long as these like frontier labs, as long as OpenAI can every year keep pumping out a more and more advanced model and the hype can continue to build, one, I think the revenues will catch up. We're already seeing that. The information leaked in an article. I think they're now at like $2 or $3 billion in revenue over just the last 12 or so months, which is like an unprecedented runway way. But at some point, governments are going to step in here and start to fund these labs directly, because it will become a national security implication. And I don't think the government is going to be looking at revenue. They're going to be looking at the capability of the model. Because they're viewing it from a national security perspective.
But that's a different argument, right? We're just talking about like market forces. If you think like the government's going to step in, then like I feel like the whole table basically changes, and like the capital markets dynamic is effectively thrown out the window, right? And you can tax whatever users you want and like funnel it into a military application. But I guess my point is, it's not about the capabilities, it's about the capabilities versus the free or the cheaper option, right? So it's about the value capture of these new capabilities versus all of these other things behind it. And so am I going to keep giving OpenAI and Microsoft $100 billion, $1 trillion to pursue the next generation of models if they're not actually capturing any value? If I'm an investor, I'm not going to do that, right? So to your point, they have to basically keep jumping 2 years ahead, 3 years ahead in order to provide an underlying intelligence to all of these companies that are going to be buying their services. If they don't have like a lead to justify 100 billion, 200 billion, 400 billion, $1 trillion in CapEx spend, then investors are not going to do that, right? So that's my point. It's not about the capabilities. It's about the capabilities relative to everybody else and the cost that it takes to get to those capabilities.
So let me hit you. Sorry.
I think
ahead.
that Moat point is like the kind of big elephant in the room for a lot of the large AI companies, right? Like we've watched OpenAI try and figure out what their moat is, and that seemingly still trying to figure it out. Is it this ecosystem? Is it ChatGPT? Most likely not. Is it their ability to build an ecosystem? Potentially. I think that's where we see a mechanism, just jumping way back in the conversation, a mechanism that actually pushes the strategic angle for a profit-making company towards open, which is what Meta are doing. Meta recognize that their moat is their distribution to users of these models, is their ability to apply them to an actual kind of real world thing rather than just trying to make money from the model itself. So they're driven to open source that model for an actual strategic gain rather than for kind of like altruism or something like that. And it's them commoditizing the complements of their product, right? Like they make the model a commodity because they're the only people who have the kind of distribution over social right now, which pushes the actual kind of technology itself out into the open, but allows Meta to continue to capture things. I think what we see happening is just more of that kind of drive to real distribution being the thing that matters. OpenAI will try and kind of provide the software to like use intelligence against that distribution, but very quickly every company that has the distribution will then want to disintermediate OpenAI. And if there's no real kind of tangible moat within their technology, that's what they'll be driven to do. The more money they make, the more they're going to try and bring that in-house. And I think there's not much seemingly stopping that from happening other than capturing the resources underneath, like the compute or the regulatory angle.
So Ben, I do feel like you said something earlier that I thought I agreed with and was very true, but it was basically like, hey, this is effectively a distribution game. And the unfortunate reality is these 5 or 6 companies have already won in distribution, right? And so we are effectively thinking how we can provide an infrastructure layer. But if you think distribution is the ultimate moat, then, you know, does that mean that you're ultimately kind of agreeing with me?
I have an answer for this one, actually, if you don't mind, Ben.
Please.
Okay,
Go
for it.
I think, you know, we have to introduce a model of social friction here. You have to think about what's going to happen when OpenAI makes its play. So let's take medical coders as an example. So, you know, medical coders are the people who listen to these transcriptions by doctors. They look at paperwork, and then they figure out which billing codes, you know, are appropriate for insurance. It's a pretty tedious job, but you can make a lot of money doing it depending on your throughput. It's kind of like piecework. Imagine that OpenAI goes in and all of a sudden rolls up the entire field of medical, you know, coding. It's plausible, right? Like they have really good models. It's a boring job. A model with infinite attention is probably going to be able to do a lot better than a person on this. So now you sort of have to imagine like what's going to happen socially when an entire profession disappears. And I think the answer is that people are going to be really hostile to these companies, and it's going to hurt their distribution. I think that people will be looking for alternatives because everyone is going to be looking at the moat for their own business, and they're going to start to do this calculation that, hey, like if I give all my data and workflows to OpenAI, like my business model could be their business model tomorrow. You know, it's the old Amazon play where they have house brands that supplant the most successful brands that show up in their marketplace.
But Travis, everyone still uses Amazon. Everyone still uses Facebook. Everyone still uses Google, right? That's the problem. Like, I agree with you, but then the consumers don't care because Amazon gives them the cheapest product, right?
Is your argument that the innovator's dilemma is like dead as a concept then? Because like it kind of says that these companies will just continue to hold that lead forever.
No, it's just not obvious to me how the system changes, right? And so like it does go back to that Clayton Christensen, like sustaining technology versus disruptive technology, right? Like right now, from what I can see, it does seem like AI is just making existing companies' products better and their distribution better, and Meta can enhance their products and Google can enhance their products, right?
So let me hit that from a different angle, maybe. And let me talk about it in sort of the terms that I described. So, imagine that companies right now are very inefficient because they were configured to organize humans. But the future companies of the world are going to be configured agentically. They're going to be configured to organize, a small group of people and a large group of agents. And so there's an argument here that, credit to Good Alexander on Twitter for this. There's an argument here that the big players are actually fundamentally obsolete if enabling AI technology is given to smaller, more nimble businesses who can organize correctly for the new paradigm. And I think that's where you can go with this in terms of
I totally agree, and I think that's like a very interesting paradigm to go down. But is it the fact that those players that end up being like way more nimble end up winning? And I think you very much could be the case. Or do basically large companies with existing cash flows and distributions just start slimming down their workforce like quite aggressively? And so maybe that is the innovator's dilemma, where doing that slimming down or shrinking your workforce like Klarna has seen is just like untenable in the way that you've organized your organization. And so new players come up and you just have this mesh of creativity and agents and people. But realistically, I also think, you're going to start running into some social constraints, as you mentioned, in terms of where the value is getting captured and how that's getting allocated. But that's, a slightly different discussion.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting little riff we're on right now. And I think it's important to think through like who can keep this flywheel going the most, who can keep acquiring money and then putting it into compute and then paying the top researchers and kind of spinning this flywheel, who can keep it going, who can spin it the fastest and keep it going the longest. And I have a couple of thoughts here and curious to hear your guys' takes on this. To me, Ben, I thought the Meta example was super interesting. And I think Meta is actually probably the best example of like somebody that's right in the crosshairs of what you were saying earlier, PD, about revenue mattering. Because from my perspective, what Meta is doing, they're spending a bunch of money to train these models and then giving it away for free. They're saying, take what we spent millions of dollars on and here, go ahead and use it. We won't charge you a single dime. I think at some point, if you hit the API, X amount of times, then they charge you. But at first it's totally free, right? They're not making any money off that right now. Zero.
But
you know what I mean?
But Michael, it's not a charity. They're doing that because they don't want to be dependent on Google and Apple. Like Mark has already been burned by like ATT. He doesn't.
I totally get it. I get the bet, but it's a big bet because they haven't made any money off of it yet, right? So like the bet is that they'll eventually make it.
They don't need to make money through an API. It's applied within Meta's products.
Yeah, but
how are they making money off of it?
But Michael, you're making my point that the model is effectively getting commoditized, right? If Meta's going to spend tens of billions of dollars, then what does that do to OpenAI's business model?
I think so, right. That's kind of my central point, is I think they're playing different games.
I agree.
Meta's giving this away. OpenAI is trying to build the leading closed source frontier model. So right, Meta's giving away their model. OpenAI can go to a drug discovery lab and say, hey, we'll run a month-long inference for you guys to synthesize some drug. And we have the #1 model in the world with the best reasoning capabilities, X, Y, and Z, the most agentic, whatever the flavor of the week is. That drug discovery company they'll pay them whatever OpenAI requests for that. That's a totally different kind of model than giving it away and making up for it on the back end by selling ads on an existing social media platform.
Yeah, I agree, but it depends on OpenAI being able to retain the lead against Meta and all these other players, right? Yeah. So if Meta also spends, $20 billion on their next generation and they hire a good number of researchers from OpenAI and they put it out there for free, then anything that OpenAI wanted to charge effectively gets thrown out the window, right? So yeah, I'm not saying OpenAI can't be a great business. I'm just saying they do have a commodification risk, and it does depend on this.
But do they
being able to bring
in? They trained GPT-4 2 years ago, and it's still the #1 model in the world. So to me, it looks like they have a 2-year lead on everybody.
I want to quibble with that. So GPT-4 is a little bit of an illusion because there have been many releases of GPT-4. Yes. Actually, current state models are beating the original release of GPT-4. And this is kind of the problem you get into closed source models. Like the companies claim that they're the same model, but they are very much not the same model. And they can be changed without notice. So if you're depending on those models to be the same, you're in for a rough ride, right? Like
totally. So to be clear, my understanding, and to your point, it's not 100% clear. My understanding is GPT-4 finished pre-training. So it finished reading everything on the internet, basically, 2 years ago. And then since then, they've been iteratively post-training it, which has improved performance. But to me, it's amazing that the base model was fully cooked 2 full years ago, and it's still competitive with today's state-of-the-art models. That suggests that they're ahead.
Yeah, so I would agree with that, right? I guess my point is more that there are no natural moats aside from talent and basically access to compute, right? So in a Web 2 era, you can benefit from these network effects, and even if you're Twitter and you have the worst execution in the world, you continue to get users and have your power law dynamics. But the world you're describing will require OpenAI to continue to invest super aggressively in order to maintain that lead, both in terms of their talent and in terms of their access to compute, which is why they've been forced to, go to Microsoft and do deals with Apple and things like that, right? And so, yeah, I think they can stay ahead. I just think it's a lot harder than in a Web 2 era where you kind of had some of these natural moats.
I kind of
feel like that gets driven down to the specific use case, right? Because we talked about distribution being the moat here, but distribution is it's access to users, but it's also specific use cases. We talk about OpenAI, hey, they can take GPT-4 and they can apply it to drug discovery, but people have been applying machine learning to drug discovery for years, and the specific companies that are doing that. And this idea that GPT-4 is going to outperform all of these specific companies designing models specifically for drug discovery, I just think is unrealistic. It shows it's a really good marketing tool. It means that OpenAI will probably get some contracts to do it. But then you look at Isomorphic Labs, Demis's specific attempt to do this. That's probably more likely to go directly after the drug discovery use cases than OpenAI, who are seemingly going after every potential use case. They're going to be spread too thin. So where in the end do they end up settling? I think they end up settling with this ecosystem of apps. Maybe that's valuable enough to warrant the kind of investment they've put into it, but maybe it's not. But I think saying that they can kind of go after potentially any market is disingenuous, because they're just going to get out competed by people going after those markets specifically.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. Do you guys have a view on that? How artificial intelligence will evolve going forward? Will the most general form of intelligence win, or will we see, to your point, Ben, smaller, more focused, and use case specific models winning at those specific use cases, and the general models being pretty good, and then the specific models being really good at specific things? Do you have a view on that?
I have a pretty cynical view. I think at the end of the day, this is just a technology that can be applied in specific areas. It's like a data access tool. You can think about models as being just an incredibly good way of compressing information, which is very effective in loads of kind of arenas, and it can have logic be emergent out of it in the sort of language models and sort of general intelligence pieces we put on it. To me, that progresses to the general intelligence part is a routing mechanism. Underneath it, you just have this better way of interacting with the data of the world. And I think you can apply that in many, many different ways. I don't think you have to have that like generally intelligent routing mechanism in order to achieve, like, to apply it to every use case. I think you can have different pieces for different places, similarly to how just technology kind of in the past could be applied to many different things in many different ways. But I think we've gone down this like focusing point where people assume you have to have a foundation model with a kind of like human-like brain to achieve any kind of good outcome. I just don't think that's the case. You look back in ML's history and you just apply ML in different arenas in different ways. I think we've kind of like for a short period of time focused in on like transformers as this thing, but I expect that to branch back out again once we see that they don't just magically solve every actual use case.
I guess I have a nuanced view on this. So I agree with what a lot of what you said, Ben. I also think it's all about tool use. So I think that a very good foundation model with exceptional tool use skills is going to win everything. And the reason for that is that it can apply all the specialist models in service of larger goals. And so I think it sort of subsumes them that way. But that's not to disagree with any of the subpoint Ben makes. Like I agree that like specialist models probably are going to have an edge for a lot of these use cases because you simply can't train or even fine tune for some, specific cases. Like GPT-5 is not going to be AlphaFold.
Hey guys, just a quick question. So we're pretty far into the conversation right now, and we are at this point debating OpenAI versus Meta. And I don't think we very clearly pointed out the breaking points or the impetus for why crypto AI can win here or potentially win. I'd like to maybe just spend like 10 or 15 minutes there. Like we got close on the electricity and the real estate argument. Like maybe it's the fact that we run out of space on data centers, or there's not enough electric, or to pondering Durian's point, like there's just the funding doesn't match out with revenue and expected outputs, and then that puts a nail in the coffin for centralized AI. But I'd love to walk through how crypto AI and that side could potentially win. And if it can't win, that's totally fine as well, if that's your opinion. But I'd like to just spend some time there. Maybe PD, we could start with you and go maybe around the room.
Yeah, sorry, I cut off briefly. But yeah, so I guess going back to our discussion earlier, I feel there are like basically disruption tends to happen from the fringe, right? And there are different capabilities that I think are on offer in decentralized AI that closed can never replicate, right? So maybe in terms of performance today, they have really strong performance using this vertically integrated scaling approach, right? And they do have proprietary data and they have access to a lot of compute because of their monopoly cash flows from kind of the first generation of the internet. But I would say crypto basically provides a more open, transparent layer on which everyone else can build, right? And so if you value that transparency, that composability, and that potential ecosystem of apps where you can verify the underlying model, you can verify the data sets, then I think you have an opportunity where over time, as the performance of decentralized compute and decentralized inference starts to gain ground, then you could have more and more folks want to tap into this ecosystem because of these additional capabilities that are layered on top, right? And so I think it is like the classic disruption framework where, hey, you have this one solution that's like spearheading ahead in one direction. I think we've talked about the scaling laws and some of the potential limits there. But hey, there are also these other advantages that are being used by fringe customers today because of their unique properties that are likely to gain in performance over time. And if the performance gets to a degree that's comparable, then it would offer a superior solution. So I guess that's my brief summary, but curious on Ben and Travis's takes as well.
Yeah, I guess to kind of answer the question directly from my side, this is going to be a very biased answer as well, given what we build at Jensen. But broadly, I think the greatest power from like decentralization and decentralized technologies is this ability to build value through flows that are very hard to intermediate and rent seek on and capture. So we've talked a lot about kind of the resources that sit underneath machine learning, and we think about them as kind of like a few pillars of these resources. Each one of those has different kind of dynamics as to whether it's open already or whether it could be captured by a large company and then kind of disallowed from anybody else being able to access it. Crypto gives us this ability to create markets over those things which stay credibly open through the mechanisms of crypto. So obviously think about compute a lot, that's what we build. But if you think about the future of that market, if we can create a way to allow demand to flow from any actual user of that resource directly to the person who owns and kind of provides that resource out, then we can create a much more highly competitive, more liquid market over that resource, which eventually trends in the kind of like the way Bitcoin trended to kind of proxy energy markets over the planet. In a way, you do the same thing with like compute as a resource underneath AI. Like you get driven to, if I have an electricity source which happens to be particularly kind of cheap, even like lots of green electricities are particularly cheap as well because there's no way of kind of harnessing them. If I can then buy a GPU, plug that in here and get instant access to the demand side of GPU compute, I'll do that because I'll earn a yield on it. Right now, I just can't do that because the only way for me to do that is to become a cloud provider. The cloud providers themselves aren't incentivized for me to be able to become a cloud provider. The kind of loop continues and then they end up buying up all of the compute and rent seeking on top of it and setting oligopolistic prices. So it just gives us this way to kind of keep that market liquid and not allow it to be captured by a centralized provider. I think you can do that for all of the resources underneath ML, and in the end you end up with more competition at the actual application stage, which is what I think we've all agreed here is the probably like where the moat actually sits. It's like providing some value to a user rather than within one of the resources.
Ben, just real quick before Travis and Mike answers, one quick follow-up question there. It sounds like from your point of view, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that the funding for hyperscale data centers and the revenue or the products that they build is somewhat unsustainable, and we're not getting the results out there that we want. And if we're able to like build this meta network connecting all of these GPUs, aka I guess electricity at the end of the day, anybody can access that to create like the largest surface area to create an AI app or agent that is the most valuable versus a centralized company like picking and choosing their trial runs and competing on just full-blown AGI. Is that like a fair approximation?
To an extent, yeah. I think when it gets into like the size piece of like whether a scale is the thing that wins, like you can, we've obviously already kind of talked about that here. That gets a bit kind of into the realms of the debate. But ultimately, you can think about it as what is the minimally extractive way for humanity to use the resources that we have. So use electricity and the conversion of electricity into kind of knowledge through GPUs. What's the way that we can do that that doesn't have as like many diversions off it where somebody's like extracting value along the way? And I think crypto and decentralization gives us the rails to create a system that is absolutely minimally extractive on top of that. So the only places people are extracting value are because they're providing value. So you think it's like somebody creates an interface to a model. If that interface is competing with lots of other interfaces, that person can make a profit, but their profit is kind of being in competition with everybody else's. It drives it down to a fair market price. That happens at multiple kind of stages along that chain, all the way down to you're accessing electricity, basically. And at the moment, we're in the situation where because compute is this kind of finite resource and is this commodity, well, it's not a commodity, it's a finite resource that's being captured by providers, they're able to take an enormous portion of the value that flows back down to it. But crypto gives us that kind of rails where that doesn't happen. I think that's just net good for the world in whichever way AI goes. It doesn't matter if like scaling continues to be the best thing, because just general kind of usage of the resource is still the most efficient way it can possibly be. And that's because there is no kind of profit-making incentive for a protocol. It just needs to sustain itself. So if it can sustain itself and can create the largest surface of kind of demand usage of that supply, then it should win out against anybody who does have to make a profit over it.
So I'm a big fan of Nassim Taleb, and I think that centralized structures are fragile. And the reason that they're fragile is they require trust. if I'm a medium-sized business and I'm using ChatGPT to provide customer service capabilities to my customers, OpenAI can switch something about the behavior of that model tomorrow, and the entire behavior of my customer service department will change. That's a huge amount of control you have to give up as a user of that application. Heaven forbid that I get on the wrong side of OpenAI, and then they could shut down my entire customer service department. There's a lot of trust I have to put in that entity that it's not going to be hacked, it's not going to behave maliciously, it's not going to behave arbitrarily. You know, we've seen with Google that they will arbitrarily shut people's Gmail accounts down for no reason that's explainable, and they will lose literally years of their memories and life to that kind of situation. And so I think that what decentralized structures enable is robustness and anti-fragility, because they can be trustless. If I can reach out and, instead of calling to OpenAI, have a really good model that is provided, you know, say by Ambient Network, then and that has known properties, that was trained in the open, that behaves in a predictable manner, I can trust that that model is going to continue to run on the network, and it can't be arbitrarily disrupted by the whims of centralized structures. As long as there's an economic incentive for that model to run, and if it's a good model, there will be, it will continue to run. And so that provides a better floor under me as a business. That provides a better guarantee for me. And that's where I think crypto AI has a lot to offer. It's all about being able to reach out and grab interesting capabilities and not have to worry about the specific organizational implementations and structures that surround those capabilities. And that composability, I think, is hugely beneficial and is really the future of where the whole economy is going.
Yeah, I think you guys both said some really interesting things there. So my take on this, and I won't comment on any like specific use case or verticals, because you guys are obviously the experts there. But my view on crypto AI is like, when I wrote my report, I tried to think about what problems does crypto solve for AI that cannot be solved anywhere else? And I think you guys both hit on several of them. For me, I identified three. Crypto is trustless. So if you're, maybe just a dumb example would be, if you're an AI agent, are you going to put your capital, are you going to trust JP Morgan Chase, or are you going to trust a wallet, a digital wallet that only you control, a public-private key on a blockchain, right? So you don't have to trust anybody in crypto. I think that's an attractive property. Actually, for humans, it can be like a scary property that you don't have someone to call on the phone. My bet is that for AI, that's going to be enormously attractive. So crypto is trustless. Crypto is deterministic. When you execute a piece of code in crypto, you know exactly what that code is going to do. There's no ambiguity in that. Whereas in like meat space, when I call my bank to make a wire, I don't know if the wire is going to happen today, tomorrow, next week, or any time this month. I think we've probably all dealt with that. Meat space is not deterministic. It's kind of stochastic. Humans are random. My bet is that AI is not going to like that. It's going to want deterministic execution of everything. Crypto offers that. And then the third piece that I think AI, that crypto can provide to AI, is like hypercapitalism. And honestly, I think that the dumbest but perhaps best example of this is meme coins. Crypto can financialize anything, will and can financialize everything and anything. And I think AI, I think that's like a unique property that AI can plug into and basically start to accumulate resources. So I think for those reasons, I'm incredibly bullish on the overlap between AI and crypto. And I think we're like just at the very early stages of discovering kind of, where the value will accrue.
I think those are great points, Michael. Really, really well said. I would also say that like one of the things that I tried to outline in my piece is, there have been constraints to protocol adoption because of the existing institutions that we have are basically made in an industrial era, right? And so if you actually have capabilities and much more of the economy move towards agents or agent-based networks, then a lot of the infrastructure that we're building starts to make a lot more sense, right? There's just today so much friction for enterprises interacting with protocols and like large legal departments that are always going to be much more conservative and much more comfortable with, an AWS, SLA, or contract, because that's just how the world works and that's what they're comfortable with, right? But in the event that you actually start outsourcing more and more decisions, machine intelligence, then I think those decision makers will start to use much more composable trustless infrastructure to the points that have been made, right? And so in the event that over the next 3 to 5 years we start to witness that transition, then I think that's like actually super bullish for Web3 infrastructure and applications, and all of those things, because it really does take both sides of the network, and we are just only starting to see the demand side really come to fruition in a way that makes sense for kind of the Web3 infrastructure that's been laid over the last 5-6 years.
I think there's a really interesting analogy there between like Web3 and AI in general, where both basically just replace human world costs with like code costs, essentially. Like Web3 came along and said, okay, replace legal contracts and like human world trust mechanisms, SLAs, and all of those things with just like execution of a smart contract. Amazing. Like that's such a cheaper way in terms of human effort of doing things. And then, like you said, AI kind of does exactly the same thing. It replaces these weird, expensive human effort things with code, essentially. It's much more complex code. So the confluence of the two is just the maximum replacement of expensive human effort things with code. And then you say, well, what's left at the end of it is that like trust piece where people say, in the human world, I do actually just value the human trust piece. Like I just want to pay extra for that. And then that's the bit that's lit with enterprises, with the old kind of like, why does anyone buy IBM? You end up with the same situation here where it's like, why am I buying from somebody like AWS in the end? And it is just because I'm willing to pay extra for the human world bit, and I'm willingly doing that. But it's been carved out and kind of hyper financialized to the point where I know I'm paying for that now. It's not this weird obfuscation like it is in the kind of traditional cloud world right now. It's this like very distinct purchase. And I think there's an angle we could take on that goes way further out, which is what happens to the future of AI. I think it's just more explicit financialization of that like human experience, where it says that our kind of like value shifts to the point where we are willing to pay more for explicit human experience, potentially irrationally against what would be the most optimal thing for us, but just because we actually value that. I'm like, I want to buy this handcrafted thing because it's handcrafted by a person. I want to buy this like cloud provider product because there's a person there, even though actually this like crypto product over here with like automatic settlement and an AI running it is actually just generally better for me. Like it's cheaper, it's more effective, it's more efficient, it leads to a better outcome, but I'm going to choose this other thing because I'm human and that's what I want to buy.
Ben, can I ask you a question, please? I think that's a really interesting insight there. One of the like bull cases I feel like for like, decentralized compute or, take something from the current AI field and decentralize it is basically like we can do it cheaper. Is kind of like the selling point, right? But then I think like the counter to that is just what you laid out. It's like, well, cost isn't always the primary concern for these guys, especially when you're talking about the most valuable companies in the world. They'll spend a couple extra mil to just not deal with the headache. You know what I mean? Or if there's an existing relationship there. Is there a tipping point where they could save so much money that the cost actually does become the primary driver? Or do these crypto AI companies is it just a reputation thing and it's going to take a couple of years for these GPU providers to like build a reputation and inroads with these companies? Like how do you see that kind of like playing out, and is there an obvious tipping point where like the competitive dynamics shift, centralized versus decentralized offerings?
I think there's like the classic friction versus benefit trade-off that you have with any kind of like new technology, where you say, hey, this is going to be different to what you currently like how you solve this problem. Are you willing to go through the friction of adopting this thing for the kind of potential benefits? And we have to go through that kind of flip. Like some people have to be willing to go through extra friction in order to adopt this thing for those like cost savings or increased scale or increased access, or whichever one of the kind of multiple benefits you see of like crypto as a technology applied to this. Once you've gone through that friction initially, then you drive that friction down to become the kind of better way of doing something without a huge switching cost. But yeah, I think we haven't really seen anyone actually conquer that trade-off yet. We've seen lots of sort of like speculative, like crypto AI things. We've seen lots of people say, hey, here are the huge benefits that exist in the future. And that's, there's lots of people that are kind of betting on that, but I think it's quite obvious that nobody's actually captured real world, like value demand here. Like there isn't very many real world use cases of like crypto AI technologies that somebody can point to and say this is driving actual value into Web2 just as a technology. And I think that's what needs to happen. And to be honest, I think it just needs a focus on building those technologies up and making them better for specific actual use cases, rather than what I think we've had, unfortunately, within the space, which is a focus on like incentivization and bootstrapping and things, which it's a distraction in our view. Like, sure, at some point, you're going to need to do a little bit of incentivization. If you're building a marketplace, you have to do a little bit of bootstrapping, but it's not the main effort. The main effort is creating like an actually valuable product. And I think we've had a bit of a period of distraction against that, but behind the scenes, a lot of people are just building those products. Once those get released, we'll see the kind of surge. But yeah, it just has to cross that barrier of friction versus cost.
But I would argue that you do need the network liquidity, right? Like one of the things, like crypto is effectively about networks, and so you do need the demand side and the supply side, and they need to come together at the same time. And in order to create that experience, like it's always super difficult to get the marketplace going out of the gate, right? And so, the supply side is not going to ramp up until it sees the demand side. And we still have like a very heavily high friction onboarding experience for most users, right? And so I think I agree, hey, focusing on product is super important, but also a lot of the benefits can only come when there's like not 5 billion, but like a tipping point of crypto wallets in terms of, the supply going to meet that demand, right? Because right now, like the users today are quite limited in terms of DAUs, I feel. So I do feel like network liquidity is quite important, actually.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to interject that I think that's a really important point, PD. And, where we end up if we put crypto with AI is actually programmable economics with decision support, and I think that for crypto previously, the decision support has been inherently lacking. Large language models are capable of ingesting a lot of information and making relatively, straightforward choices based on all those inputs. And that, something you just have to think is previously impossible. Like if I tried to write a contract on Ethereum to, parse a news story and decide whether the sentiment was positive or negative, like I have to do a lot of hackery, let alone, trying to write a summary of that that would be, a consistent and plausible representation of it that would allow me to make an economic decision. So, we're actually introducing a level of capability and reasoning that I think makes the underlying economic APIs much more attractive than they previously were.
Just on the kind of like the bootstrapping of the marketplace that we talked about. It's true that you will at some point need to do some level of bootstrapping. I'm not saying that you don't need to kind of make sure that there's a balance between supply and demand, but I think your use case makes a huge difference as to how much of that you need to do. Like if you think about the case of Helium, where you're providing kind of like network coverage for people to use, that's subject to Metcalfe's law from telecoms, where that network only really has value at massive scale, which means you have to really heavily bootstrap the supply side before you actually provide any value to somebody. There are other use cases that just aren't subject to that. Like you think about like access to a GPU. If I have a single GPU and a single person who wants to train a model on one GPU, I can have like a transaction that somebody can get real world value from this network. Yeah, it's not at the maximum scale it'll be, but you can grow that iteratively naturally rather than having to go through this like maximum bootstrapping process. I think the weird situation we're in right now with like GPU networks, for example, is everybody's competing over number of GPUs. No one's actually like using those GPUs. Like, where's the demand side usage? So like we go down this kind of rabbit hole of like getting as many GPUs collected as we can. It's the wrong metric. The right metric is getting actual usage, getting people sending tasks to devices and getting their results back. And if that happens on a smaller scale initially, I think that's actually better than getting one of the sides massively bootstrapped and then you can't serve the other one. It only really works in the situation where you have supply of a commodity with like a linear kind of value scale as the network scales. But I mean, luckily for us, ML compute happens to be one of those things. Like, I think if you are in that like network bandwidth mode, you just have to figure out how to do the supply side bootstrapping. That's just the game you have to play. You've got to make sure your demand side takes over in the short window you have to be able to subsidize supply side. Otherwise, you're not going to kind of win.
Where do you see demand coming from in the nearish term?
For compute networks or
decentralized compute networks.
Yeah, I think there's a few different areas where it can come from. I think the like seed to Series A kind of startups who don't have access to cloud providers right now are one kind of vector. Individual users who don't have local compute but want to fine tune a model, for example, they want to do a slightly more with the typically open source models that they have access to, but they can't then get access to the compute to do it. And then further kind of along, but potentially not too far along, is collaborative like training of models. So can the community come together, propose a new kind of type of model, but not get access to compute as a resource? Well, now they can get access to compute as a resource. They also have lots of tools that come with kind of Web3 in general on pooling capital in order to activate that resource together without having to trust a single party, etc. I think we just end up with much more collaborative development of models on top of like compute networks and data networks, and to an extent, expert knowledge incentivization networks, which are kind of like, can I sort of propose this model and then be rewarded in the future for being the person that proposed it because there's a kind of point on chain on says I kind of created it and put it out into the world. So it just like more and more as we get value attribution back to the originator of the resource or the kind of thing, I think we incentivize that collaborative work, and then that's when the flywheel really starts. But yeah, before then you can have just simple usage that you would see right now with cloud providers that's typically either priced out or just can't access at all in some cases.
I think that as you see agentic capabilities being required for blockchains to be considered competitive, that you're going to see a ton of utilization of these sorts of networks.
I agree with that. When models start needing access to the resources to trigger themselves and other models, that's when this thing goes completely exponential, because you remove that sort of same way as we talked about in loads of other areas, like the human world cost. It's gone. You need incredibly liquid access to that resource at that point. Otherwise, it's always going to be limited essentially by the efficiency of the resource market underneath it. So we have to make those as efficient as possible if we want to progress as fast as possible. But yeah, totally agree. Like the whole thing changes once models are actually accessing the resources, which we find incredibly exciting. Like that, I think that's going to be a pretty big moment.
Here.
I'm glad you brought that up, Travis. That was something that I was hoping we would hit on at some point. I didn't want to be. It feels a little sci-fi right now, but I think people underestimate how quickly that will happen. I saw a tweet the other day. It was a OpenAI researcher, and he basically made the point. Said something along the lines of, it's crazy that, or imagine how amazed a person would be 10 years ago if you pulled them to today and said, we have a program, a technology that can do real-time language translation between any language in real time instantly here for free. Anybody can use it around the world for free. So that's a thing today, but nothing's changed. The world is still the same world from before that. And
he said it much more eloquently than I did. But the point was like, we had this massive breakthrough and nothing seems to have changed. You know what I mean? Like the price of Nvidia went up a lot, but other than that, we'd still eat breakfast every day. I'm still drinking coffee. You know what I mean? So, and I think that for crypto as well, like we've had these massive AI breakthroughs and crypto's kind of still chugging along. You know, Bitcoin's not even at an all-time high right now. You know what I mean? So like, when is this point? When is like the huge tipping point? When is the exponential? My current view is I think it's whenever we get agents, because for me, and I think for most people in the crypto community, it's obvious why agents would prefer a blockchain over traditional infrastructure. And I think it's really hard it's hard for me to wrap my mind around like the idea that like from day 0 to day 1, like there could be 0 agents, and then there could be like an unbounded amount, millions, billions of mini instantiations of intelligence that are engaging in economic activity, totally isolated from each other. And I think a lot of that is going to happen on blockchain, and just the potential is like incredible there.
I do feel like it's like that USB chart where you have the infrastructure and the apps and the infrastructure and the apps. And I thought that like that one point by the altimeter guy that basically, if you look at cloud, you know, there's 400 billion that accrues to applications, and there's like 50 billion that accrued to semiconductor players, right? And right now we've effectively had the inverse in terms of Gen AI, where you have, you know, 75 billion that's accrued to NVIDIA effectively, and 5 billion that's accrued to OpenAI. And those things are going to flip, right? And so, you know, if it's anything like cloud, you would expect a coming application explosion and most of the value capture to start leaking up the stack, right? So I 100% agree with that.
I think that that's why this ecosystem is so important, and why it's actually why I'm very happy to see a lot of different approaches and healthy competition in the space. Because I think that there's just going to be so much demand for all of the above that it's going to be a feast for everyone. And I think that people who see it are going to be, you know, richly rewarded. And I hope for those listening that, you know, you're persuaded by some of our arguments, because I'd like you to benefit financially from this too.
Guys, I think that's a phenomenal point to end. I don't think you guys realize how hard it was to just not say anything and listen. You guys are just so smart, and I learned so much. I want to thank all of you for coming on and having a phenomenal conversation, especially for over 2 hours. Incredible and timeless, and you're all parts of incredible projects, especially the Delphi boys. But I can't wait to get this out and really appreciate it. And if anyone listening is starting a crypto AI project, feel free to DM me or anyone here. We're happy to DD you and potentially fund you. Thank you, guys.
This was
Thank
fun,
you
guys.
so
Thanks.
much.
Thanks,
Really
guys.
appreciate your time.
Really enjoyed this. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.